The Owl by John Hawkes. Part 5. He hangs. Finally, the night enforced quiet. The tunneling cicadas, the cicadas taking the moonlight on patches of snow, were still. The shadows maneuvered, the eternal flanking movements and frozen sorties of the night were taking place. The brook ran cold, and the mountain slopes, so far and of silver, marched upon the rain, absorbed the moonlight like black cloth the sun. Houses were deserted at dark when the four-legged animals, not many, hung their heads. The fortress imprisoned only the empty hooks. The ice span told no time. There was the webbed fern, the rafter, the proclamation's promise, and the iron doors ajar, the bishops and gaolers done convening and taken to bed until morn. The galax opened its sharp leaves to prick the prowler, and there was an odor of night's roots. The owl was awake. He swelled his chest, breathed restlessly, and made himself known in the dark as if it were not deep enough. He was dissatisfied with the still lingering light, and kept to his corner. Now and then, slow and purposeful, he eased himself from the pitch, and moved in front of the window, his claws biting the ledge, his outline contesting heaven and plain, tree and pillar. He looked, and the bare window was driven behind him, or blinked and was awake, frowning at the fortress and murmuring skies beyond the cliff. He looked so violently he heard nothing. Insects darted in and out of his feathers, and they were nothing to him. So long did he stare to see all that was in the night as before, and before that. He looked steadfastly at the universe, then turned his back and proceeded to chew, pick, beat his cold heart, rustle so imperceptibly active with continuous life. Revengeful was he toward that which made him turn his white face and look into the dark. He was old, scabrous at the window. He regarded the night from his stone and branch, and all the night was preoccupied with some stretching of tissue or memory deep within the feathers, while rectifying the vision of the world in his owlish eyes, watching it as he might something that dared not move. He silhouetted himself, and from that glance the night could not shrink into hiding in the atmosphere. He gripped Antonina's purse in his claw, and now and then shook it. Already it was ripped and musty, as if it had been his forever. At times it fell to the window ledge, and he kept near it. Back and forth he went, continuously at work, conniving and busy within his feathers or lice eggs, watching the dark, flitching, flickering. He cut his bill on the stone, preened disinterestedly. Once, with slow effort, with a great plying of nerves and muscle, he slowly shut his eyes, down, and obliterated the shadows, the space, and it ceased. Then, look, the dilation, and they were round again, greater, the horned moons. He moved across the rim of his nest, Sasso Fetore, at the window. He outlined himself again, and, face into the night, his head began turning so little, but sharply, right, left, and this was his alertness. Something of all he saw aroused this speculation. Something fallen upon that eye stirred him. The owl carried Antonina's purse to the window and shook it, and the leaves in the scrub tree shook also. One claw was missing, another cut off, blunt and short. At every feathered layer he was scarred and covered with old wounds that penetrated him like the grain of wood, his fibre, the old markings of the forest. But he had never cried with the pain, the scarred face, the face enraged and bloody, always anesthetized with the cold enormity of the eyes, the sudden circumference of the eyelids protecting him, making him insensitive. Light began again to rise steaming from the earth, and from the owl's eye, slowly, lighted the knowledge of the day to come. He stiffened, watching the cicadas stop, and all about his motionless body the hoary, piercing feathers rustled in the breeze, as if they were no part of him. He glanced at the frosted shadows, the warped tree laden with a winter provision of dead mice, at the cold pump. It was morning, but only he could see through the blackness, yet heavy to the light that was kindling. And he hooted, warning that someone was approaching up the winding road. Senor Barabo came from the mist and halted near the window. He was wet, having come at this odd moment to take the owl's attention. Il gufo, boya, he whispered, stooping and white. He looked up and bowed his head. He, on the ledge, waited. Senor Barabo stooped under his burden. I had not expected, master, turning his mouth on its side, whispering, squinting out of the frost. For her, I could not have asked you, boya. Barabo's good fortune. I would not have missed it. Principale, I would reach up to you. On his back he carried a black trunk, rounded and banded at the ends. Wet black hair fell from under his broad hat. The face of whiteness and dark lines hung there, smiling. The neck bulged with labor. He had walked all the night. You must pardon me, Altezza, grunting, Riley twisting under the load. 2 men could not be found, so I have come alone. Half the treasure is here, boya. Once he raised his voice. Dowry, he exclaimed. He stood at the edge of the cliff, and his fingers clamped the brass handles. The black lines of the face, sweat-strewn, slyly peered upward. He had discarded the cummerbund, and his ankles were thick with mud. It is a pleasure, boya, for me to bring this heavy load myself. Since sundown he had carried it. And suddenly he dropped one shoulder, swayed as if he could bear it no longer, and the cask was loose, fell out of sight, and split wide on the first rocks, smashing, and its collection of coins showered down the slope until all was quiet again. Ah, sfortunato! His eye cut narrowly, and he wiped his nose. Senor Barabo turned on a heel, and his voice coming as through the rain-drenched forest, Hangman, follow me. A gust of wind carried his hat also down the cliff, and with that again he fixed upon the owl his night-worn face. Pocenta saddled the donkey. We set off in single file down the morning rim of the quarry of Sassofeltore. Pocenta walked at the donkey's head, limping, pulled the damp halter. All about was the stillness that follows fugitive action, and we proceeded through that time of dawn when the werewolf gives up his feasting and the assassin lifts his hands from the jugular vein of history. We met the first citizen in a doorway awaiting our approach. Triumph to your day, hangman, and the citizen fell in line behind us until we met the next, shivering, and more after that, sentinels suddenly coming alive from the low entrance to the café and along the down-winding route. Those who, with their hands and feet, their persons, making no noise, pointed the path that we should take. Is it the same? It is, Signor Barabo. They have not wakened, perhaps, in my absence? They have not wakened, Signore. So Signor Barabo questioned each. These men, as they swung one after the other from niches and cold casements, out of the walls, followed us, scenting and long-legged and sleepless, wet with uncomprehending vigilance. Over their brown shirts they wore short black jackets, strapped high to their white throats. Power this day, Il Gufo, they murmured, surprised that I had come, and were gladly relieved. The donkey braced his feet on the stones. It was not yet morning. The bells marked time coldly. No one peered from the windows. None proffered fowl or wine as we passed in single file. A gargoyle hid its face in corroded hands. I marched down through the people's hutch, thatch, sleep. Who lives here? An old woman, boya. She is asleep. Even I had not seen this yard before. Under the hollow tile was an iron wall disappearing without vine or air hole into the earth. Leathern feet crowded and stirred upon her property while she slept, and the gate to her yard was open, pulled from its wooden hams. One had mounted the stones avalanched between wall and privy. Silent, motionless over the others' heads, he watched the approach from the hill below. Another, with large stride, paced off the width of the yard and tapped his head grimly to remember it. There was tar paper over the old woman's window, a trough filled only with a bed of fermenting straw, and the back step where she took the sun. All became cold and removed, visited by the dawn mongers and the inquisitive strangers, because of the event perpetrated on this spot. The deputation filled her yard like black chessmen thrust into the dampness and sands of ruin. The bony ponchos and black hats hovered to and fro, staring at the corpses in the idle chill. The prefect was on his knees. His eyes protruded. The kepi was at his side. Senor Barabo sat down near the prefect on the trough of stinking straw. Traces of light began to flow onto the horizon with the roar of wind. "Can you tell me when it occurred?" "Perhaps, signore. Perhaps they have only been here a few hours, or more." "And they are dead, then?" "Dead. They are cold, signore." The prefect's 4 ganders lay at the base of the iron wall, and their white bodies were frost-covered and gripped in the weeds, to be seen at the prefect's knees with all their dismal inertness and roundness of breast sparkling and portentous. They appeared white through the feathers, through the flesh, and to the earth. Their eyes lay like black berries, half in the sand. Through the bills the nostrils were bored with blue augers, as worn holes in wood. 4 hours at least, signore. The long-lying feathers were immaculate, though the wing of one bird was crumpled, fanning, uncomfortably jointed, against the black wall, and hung there hazardous and spread as if it would defy the upsweep of air, no longer temperate in Sassofeltore. Otherwise, in the small space, they geometrically marked the 4 points of the compass, unruffled, exact creatures as they were left after death. The prefect did not touch them. He merely leaned further forward, put his hands upon the dirt near their circle, and bowed so that the smoke from his cigarette burned his lip. He peered at the ganders, who would no longer invade the impossible cliff-top and campanile of Sassofeltore, bedded down now emphatically in the place they would not have chosen to protect themselves from storm. Not turning, with the smoke still branching and forking back from his lowered face, the prefect whispered, "Do you see the murderer?" The one on the rocks hesitated. He opened his eyes wider, examined quickly the architectural slope and the ferns, and shook his head. Senor Barabo's mouth fell as if to exclaim, but he remained silent, and one after the other the black figures rotated, stood a moment at the prefect's shoulder to look. The ganders would no longer march through the steep places of Sassofeltore, circling upon ridges, gables, spiked walls. No longer would they search the flagons, search the tall ladies' piazza, the fortress, the field of dead foot soldiers, for the cliff and kernel of Flemish seeds, for a crack in the ice, for the remnants of the dark days. "They are dead, signore, I feel it here. These are the lumps in the neck. There is a hardness under the bill, signore." And the prefect withdrew his hand, spitting away the smoke and tobacco. The ganders had been felled carefully, symmetrical and clean. The long necks, straight, each perpendicular to the next, were crossed one over the other near the heads, the necks touching and torn, left in their severed lines and with their cold windpipes this intimate, unnatural pattern. The ganders, whose eyes gleamed logically, whose march was rhetorical, surmounted the prisoner's sudden inspiration to kill them, and survived his warped and cunning urge to lay their bodies in crudely artful fashion. The donkey rang his bells dumbly, and none heard. The straw fermented. The guard on the rock pile lost his eyes into the mist, and gave no alarm. There was no sign of the one who fled. Pucento, with tentative finger, felt over and over again the slashes imprinted on the earth by wingtips and fierce talons. Another stood waiting, and from the wooden saddle, my feet slanting as iron and one fist upon the tin tattooed horn, I motioned them away, signaling that they leave their posts and wet odor of the yard. I pulled on the rein sharply. The dawn became the color of the pair's belly, and not long from that time the prisoner's discarded, tall, half-broken wings were found abandoned against the whitewashed sidings of a stall. The straps that had bound them to him hung stiffly. In the mud his footprint was recognized where he struggled free. Before the Sabbath labors began, the citizens of Sassofeltore saw for themselves the old woman's yard, and filed past to stare at the wings by the barn where they were rumored to be. When darkness came again, the wings were illuminated with the flare of 2 torches, and were visited even then. The children looked for signs of his toes in the wet sand. They whispered upon hearing the bell that was struck hourly as long as he was free. And he was not free for long, but was returned to the cell from which he had escaped, to the 4 hooks, and put upon them. No one gathered at the fortress, satisfied with the announcement that he was there. His wings were splashed with kerosene and burned where they stood. In a matter of hours his cries commenced again, and peaceful anticipation possessed the owl. The citizens listened quietly as they stared at the pool in the grass, now empty, and the sun set. The crowd dispersed from the smoking wings that cowered, withered, fell to ash. Some days later, the prisoner was still suspended on the hooks. The skin was drawn away from his belly in one piece and stretched across a drum that was beaten through the streets while they stopped work and listened. The Pentecost was past. The prefect, as was prescribed at this time, fasted and shaved his head. He was ready, imprisoning himself with the condemned until he should be brought to me. All of Sassofeltore returned to read the proclamation with more care. The drumming upon the prisoner's flesh continued. Sometimes the drummer was followed by women and the mongers. Sometimes he beat alone through the steady rain, and he took the old courses of the ganders, going nowhere in particular, but marching and tapping the drum so that all would hear during the day. Sometimes the cries stopped, and that too was heard. The old men waited in the cafe, and they no longer spoke of Lucia or Teresa. "Listen, Signor Barabo, it is past." "Yes. And listen, thou, do you hear him hammering?" "Yes. He is coaxing his noose and knot." "Il gufo." The owl waited for the drummer to come, and each time bestirred himself so that he might watch. He sanctioned the herald to stop and to strike 4 extra beats for the owl, and move on. The millet grew ripe, and hampers of blood apples were left in the hangman's piazza. A stone of bread was left also. Those in the cafe waited, and made no move to kill the lizards that came from their caves in the fireplace. The bent grass sprang up again near the wall in the old woman's yard. The rooks flattened themselves in their nests on the cliff. The fox came into the streets, but was not noticed, traveled up and down my road. Pacento brushed the donkey's black trappings. The monarchical owl stared about the proximity of the execution. The prefect buried the ganders, and Sassofeltore had nothing else to think of, nothing else to prepare for. One morning the drumming ceased. The fox hastened back to his hole. The bells ceased. Monco did not fish that day, and the fish remained deep in their pools. The cicadas were hushed. The cries were hushed in the fortress, the prefect giving the prisoner water from a tin cup. That morning Signor Barabo saw nothing of his wife and daughters. The fortress towered its 3 parts over the city, and nothing stirred. The yellow hammers appeared and flew into the sun, and the rose campions speckled the hillock, the path by the headstones. Sassofeltore was raw with the sun that fell headlong upon the unoccupied streets and before the Campanile, the waiting city. Bright, clear, reddening the cliff, the sun rose and spread down across the unlabored fields. There was silence. None came from their shelters, while the shot of the sun tore at the white flags raised on the bare masts, and shone upon the ascending slopes with their briar, a few huts, inviting the spirits to come again to that empty plain. All day the sun warmed the copper in the eyes of doors and dried the tall lady in the piazza. "Listen," murmured Senor Barabo. "It has stopped." And they listened, not venturing from the dark. It was a day during which the citizens sat until they must change a knee or arm, and whispered while the sun swelled the streets with the light. No meals were prepared, but now and then they drank small quantities of spumante or rosolio. They had not forgotten the long, white, and crossing necks, nor, perhaps, their daughters. They had not dared to write the Donna. The mongers themselves could not escape the superstitions, even when the sun wetted the gardens and filtered to gleam upon the white presses. The crabgrass grew again. The old men did not attempt to seek their neighbors. Those who were already congregated when this day came remained so, waxen within the cellars or the cafe. No one gave thought to attiring the young women in hammered silver and lace. The council of crisis and the occasion of tragedy reached them during daylight hours, and when the sun was high, Sassofeltore was lighted the whole day and filled with the ferment of the sun rays. The day passed. Only at dusk did a soft murmuring, the dialect and talk, start from the houses. Then some tried to remember the prisoner's face, and they haggled over who had touched him and who not. The old woman who had proffered him the roasted fowl declaimed that she had retrieved it whole again, that he had not a chance to bite into it. The fathers would not speak a word to their daughters. When it was dark, Pucento carried in the kegs of grain, the bowl of blood apples, the pail of dissected chicken, the spice and paste and fish packed in leaves from the piazza. He built a fire using the tinder and flint intended for the Donna. He cooked until midnight and heaped the brown pieces of meat and the strips of white fish on the stones, and the fat drained into the fire, crackling and hissing. He brushed the earth from the blood apples, and steamed them until they were soft and strong of odor. He cooked black twigs that tasted as chicory, and the water boiled in the pan. The bones fell from the fish, the skin and meat became tender and dropped loose. Now and then he returned to the court and discovered another homage food deposited there, perhaps a vegetable the color of rattan, and this he cooked. He found a bucket of eggs no larger than walnuts. He boiled them, and he replaced the eyes in the fish heads. He stirred, snipped, built up the fire, and we drank cognac. One small bird he roasted, and this he stuffed, showing his teeth and pushing his thumbs with a handful of green grass, pale and fresh. He burned his arms and did not notice. He worked his knife on the block, and he bled. The blood apples broke their skins, and he took them from the rumbling water with his burned fingers. How different from the monger's fragile fish, or the square, dark loaf and water. The pewter was filled, the flat leathern platters smooth as wood were filled, and the chicken stones, the sticks wet with fat, the hearts like cherries, and the joints, the twists of bread were devoured, heaped up, and then eaten. The owl sat long, with a large and savory chunk of white meat in his bill. The smoke backed into the grate, and was filled with the moisture of feasting. Pucento scooped at the black fish roe. I ate the sickle-shaped sections of a fruit, and the fire lighted our red hands. Pucento sat with his elbows between his knees, his cheeks wet, and his eyes heavy, until the meal was done, and the intestines could not move. The donkey's freshly polished harness hung on the wall. The casket containing the rope was ready. "I shall see little Ginevra, Gufo." Yes, and the rest of them, and the meal, torn from the anatomy of conscience, sat upon us. From the quantity found and cooked so seldom, there came the effulgent memory of execution, step by step, dismal, endless, powerful as a beam that transudes our indulgence on the earth, in Sassofeltore. There was suddenly the morrow, the way the brain sees death suddenly, and there was the penalty that could not be stayed. Lastly, we chewed mint leaves. In sleep, there were the fantastic shapes of the food, the sensation of looking forward, searching ahead into the rubrics burning upon the slopes of the rose campions. Gathered about my bed were the hangman's articles, the gloved creatures of dreams paraded all night, and 100 times I settled the noose before dawn, and straightened it, and turned it. And the eye opened to find it cold, partially light, silent, the windows were open, all pushed a crack or flung wide, and the door was off its latch. The cold had come early and lay about the rooms. I rose, strapped a wide belt around my flesh. The stones were cold. I saw the ledge, empty and small, wet, from which the prisoner jumped. Pucento slept in his clothes, and the lips were pulled back from the teeth. I shook him, and he waked, clutching at my chest, and said, "Is it over, il gufo? Is it finished? Have you hung him without me?" Then leapt from the bed, and brought my cap and cape. The crowds were in the piazza before us, ranked on 4 sides of the tall lady, and pressing close to the gallows of white hickory. The empty arms, the cold hands, were folded, and skull touched skull. I climbed to the top, the platform, and Pucento crept to the bottom, into the small space where the prisoner would fall. My footsteps crashed above Pucento's head, and down there, out of sight, he crouched back against the wood and hid his face, trembling, sick as upon sea-water, cowering in the darkness lest he be struck by the descending feet. I stood. I might only have been searching the countryside from the low tower, or kicking a splinter of glass down to the rooks. I looked over their heads through the slits. The soft black horn atop my hood curved forward and shook slightly in the wind, and the red cape, the collar of red, was short and left my arms free. The gallows faced the fortress. Not an old man, woman, and child, but what was here, and stooping in his brown shirt, grey cloth, and thinking of the book from which their hangman knew the terms and directions, the means and methods to destroy a man. The wind blew, and there was the odor of the hemlock at the border. The bare firmament of the cliff was hidden behind the heatless crumble of Sassofeltore. The cold and dripping hole waited in the tall tree. My ward, all of them, was sick under me. With my fists I tore the eye slits so that I might see further, and see them from such dilated eyes. I passed, shaking the horned hood at them, and stopped. The prefect brought the prisoner quickly from the fortress, under the portcullis, down the rampart, through the winding street, past the colonnade, between the crowds which opened, and into the piazza at last to the tall lady. The one and the other walked quickly and with single purpose, their hair blowing, one official and one man walking as if they might not reach the gallows after all. The prisoner's greatcoat was open, and it beat about his ankles. He walked now, cane, foot to stone. And then there was no further for him to walk. The two of us stepped to the center of the trap, that board which shall be fastened so that it be firm at the proper time and fail at the proper time, leaving the foot nothing but emptiness. The muscles at the corners of the prisoner's mouth were hard, like welts. There was not a minute more. He made a gesture as if to remove the greatcoat, but I bound his wrists, strapped the ankles, pulling the thongs tight. I put the hood upon him, down over the ears. I lifted the noose, higher, with both hands, lifting, and fixed it more easily than I dreamed. Then he stepped off the trap. And that one noise of machine and man echoed and rebounded against the 4 sides of the piazza, against the campanile and the low tower, and disappeared down my winding road. Then, in the silence, the trap banged several times, like a door. I stood at the edge of the pit, where the rope before me descended quiet and taut, tugged, steady, as some line dropped through a hole into the center of the earth. And in the crowd, back near the wall, I saw Antonina. Already her hair was gray, and her complexion altered, the lips compressed, the temples shiny, and her habits and her character so true and poorly tempered that no man would come for her, and the rest of her days would be spent with the manual for the virgins not yet released to marriage. And then there was the air, damp and cold, and the owl exerting himself into flight, beating through the top branches now, shutting his eyes and crashing through the twigs to the dripping hole in the trunk, settling himself and sitting inside the bark for summers and winters, and he stayed thus, peering out of the warmth, the tenure of silent feathers in a cold tree. Thus stands the cause between us. We are entered into covenant for this work. We have drawn our own articles and have professed to enterprise upon these actions and these ends. And we have besought favor, and we have bestowed blessing.